Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a realm where reality intertwines with the inexplicable, where the boundaries of reason dissolve into the shadows of uncertainty. Welcome to the political twilight zone. I am your guide through this enigmatic labyrinth, where politics and power take on life of their own. In this dimension, the threads of truth weave a tapestry of intrigue, challenging our perception of the world we thought we knew. In this world, nothing is as it seems, and the truth lies buried beneath layers of deceit. Prepare to venture where reason meets the unexplained, and where the unexplained might just be the old. Welcome back, everybody. Rick Wagner here, getting it right here on KZZ KGLN on another weekend. Appreciate your listenership. And yes, we have the situation well in hand here as well as we can. For those of you that didn't hear the bumper music on the podcast, I had to play the theme song from Mighty Mouse cartoon. Many of you may not remember it, but you can certainly Google it. And it is appropriate, I think, to these days. So I'm very glad, folks, that I did not spend any time talking about the debate last week because, as predicted, it's been pretty much the only thing anybody's talked about all week. And that is not a particularly good thing. I become concerned over the media's ability to take one or two stories and just beat them to death. It's never any fun to see anything beaten to death, but the story is just not only sad to see, but it's annoying. How many times can you have the same opinions given? How many times can you hear the same summaries? And you name it. On some of the TV shows, the cable shows in particular, what you get is a topic, a panel discussion about the topic, a veritable rant from one of the hosts. Then, at the end of the hour, it transitions to another host who then introduces another panel who say pretty much the same thing, but with different faces, and then there's another rant. Now, I don't say I don't enjoy the shows sometimes, but, you know, there's a lot more going on in the world out there than just that. It doesn't mean it's not important, but these other things affect it and raise its importance, actually. And so when you know about them, it helps you put things in what we like to call context. This is what bothers me about cable news anymore. There's no context on anything. Everything's a wild-eyed emergency. Now, I do feel like we are in sort of a DEFCON 4 sort of situation here in the United States. Things have gotten pretty bad, and if things don't straighten out a little bit in the next election, they're just going to get worse. But in the meantime, there's a lot going on that affects this and puts it in context about, okay, if things go well in the election, what is that going to look like? If they don't go, what is that going to look like? I think those are interesting questions to come up with. And one of the things that you have to consider is what's going on militarily in the rest of the world. And we just seem to ignore that when we've got something that's very lascivious or whatever the case may be in the news. So I feel like we should talk about it because you need to know. Here's something I found kind of interesting. You know, I'm a little obsessed with China apparently here. I mean, I'm not consciously that way, but they do seem to be doing a lot of things. But here's a little story. Breitbart did have it. I think that was sometime during this last week. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, I think all these great names. I wish I could. On Monday, they indicated that based on satellite imagery obtained by the organization, Cuba has significantly expanded some of its electronic eavesdropping stations with suspected ties to China. Okay, so the satellite imagery showed an unprecedented look at 4 active bases that the communist regime operates in Cuba. The 4 listed facilities are among the most likely locations to support China's effort to spy on the United States. Really? Are they doing that? Oh, why did they bother to do that? They just sent a balloon over here. We don't know anything about it. They have the satellite imagery reviewed for the report showed the base is having a large circular disposed antenna array with a projected diameter of 130 to 200 meters. That's about 426 to 656 feet. Yes, did you notice that? You know, especially on an island like that. They explained in this story, without access to classified materials, the exact specific targets of these assets, in other words, what they're trying to spy on, is nearly impossible, but I'm sure we can guess. It nonetheless described the space monitoring equipment present at sites like the Bajulikal and Calabazar as notable, given that Cuba lacks its own satellites or space program. So if they don't have any satellites or space program, but there appears to be a base set up there, very sophisticated base to monitor satellites and space program. As I said before, the Chinese are very serious about this taking over the space race thing. They say it all the time. And like I talked about before, they've been to the far side of the moon with essentially an AI piloted ship once it lost its radio contact, gathered samples, blasted off, reconnected to its host vehicle, and then came back and landed in China. Now, they're pretty much ahead of us a little bit on that, I have to say. In the meantime, we blast up a bunch of people who we apparently hire on diversity standards in the space shuttle, and they float around up there and wave at us, and then we bring them back. And I'm not exactly sure many times what the point of these trips are. They do just seem to be able to put new people on, like, this is the first school teacher from Alabama who doesn't have a left toe to go into space. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure that's really the scientific research we're looking at. And they do a little research in there, but the Chinese are very serious about dominating the space in the future. The Russians try a little bit, and they're behind now because, they got their hands full of other things. But the Chinese are just going full throttle, and we don't do anything. Now, you may say, like I've said before, if you don't understand space, it's understandable. And that is that, just remember, it's the high ground. That's all you got to know. And it also is a way to dominate what we utilize in a day-to-day way. As you drive around, and if you have one of those newer cars that has a map in it and all this kind of stuff, that just doesn't happen by accident. We have global positioning satellites up there that relay that information. We also have military-grade global positioning satellites that are even more accurate and shielded somewhat from attack that are trained for our military uses, where we're much more precise. But we've gotten so reliant on these things that if they were to go down, what would we do? I mean, it's a sad thing, but there are so many parts of our everyday life now that for the most part didn't exist 25 years ago, or certainly not, just embryonically, that now we seem as though we couldn't get by without them. I mean, just try and go to somebody's place and ask them to put their phones away. And I'm not just talking about kids. We all know people who are not kids anymore that are also addicted to their phones. That's all fine and good. It's okay with you, but at the same time, that is something that has emerged just recently. And to be so wedded to it is a little spooky. So you go after that kind of technology, disable it in some way over this country, it's an enormous advantage. These cyber attacks are really serious. The ability to control or disable our computer networks has now become a very viable and, as they like to say on the left, existential threat, because so much of our defense systems and offense systems are based on that technology. And in the meantime, we are trying to decide if a cadaver can continue to be president. That really doesn't help our standing in the world. And things are happening all around the world that we need to pay attention to. So that's why I bring up there's 4 bases that they're building in Cuba. This is Cuba, okay? Remember we had like we had talked about this last week. We had like the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then remember the Monroe Doctrine that was supposed to be kind of like our area, sort of like the Romans, RC. Yeah, who are not supposed to have foreign powers in there. Well, guess what? They're all over the place now. The Russians are not as prominent in Cuba as they used to be because they had enough economic problems of their own. They were no longer propping up the Cuban economy as much as they were. But the Chinese have kind of supplanted that, and they're now just laboring away. It would be nice if people in our government would pay a little more attention to that. Maybe they are, but we certainly don't hear about it. All right, everybody. Thanks a lot for sticking around through the break there. So, moving on to things that also were very important and were very lightly covered this week. I mean, and I understand. We had all sorts of news that was shocking. Well, I don't think it's so shocking to us. I mean, take a look at that dude. I mean, I'm surprised that they managed to get him there. He is pretty active now, though. By golly, he's going to stay in this fight. I mean it. It's a big deal. Or in Biden talk, we could say a dig meal or something like that. You know the thing. But at the point we're at now, it's a free-for-all, isn't it? I can't recall, historically even, certainly not in this century, this kind of tumult in terms of a sitting president, the attack on the other candidate, the bizarre nature of the left's response to everything, their incredible hyperbolic discussion about what might happen if Donald Trump were to win, since we've already had him as president once. I'm not exactly sure if they remember that or not. They don't act like it, do they? Act like he's just come out of nowhere. Look, he's an evil demon. He's come out of the dark. He's going to scare us all. That's not happened before. Things were pretty good till COVID. But it's been a sad, sad time, really. And I think that this is one of those turning points, as we've discussed before, the fourth turning, and that great book, that there'll be some sort of realignment. Now, what that means exactly, I'm not sure. That's one of those things that's easy to say, well, I think there's going to probably be a realignment. Really? Along what axis, do you think? I think it's going to depend on us. I think that if this next election goes badly for conservatives, that if the liberals have enough, well, not liberals, progressives, have enough free range that the government controls, then it'll be pretty hard to knock them off and make them leave office, because they'll have a stranglehold in the system. They pretty much do now. And they will make sure, if they get enough power after the next election, that they continue that and only strengthen it. All under the guise of protecting democracy, without actually doing things that are protecting democracy. For instance, isn't it up to the people to vote their leader? It doesn't seem that way. It seems like that if you don't vote the way that they want you to, there's something really wrong. It's really, really wrong. I mean, it's essentially an attack on the country in their minds. Well, what they say anyway. Some of them don't seem like they mind attacks on the country, but they say this anyway. And yet, some of the bedrock principles that the nation was founded on, some of them go all the way back to England and the Magna Carta and all that stuff, has something to do with the will of the individuals who are being governed. And we have a pretty firm ground on which we can point to that. The first line of our Constitution is, "We the people," not "you the government," which is very disappointing to the government, I might add. So, isn't it okay if we were to vote for somebody different? Sure doesn't sound like it. I mean, the left is just one step away from saying that people that support Donald Trump need to be rounded up in some way or lose their right to vote. You name it. It's too much. There's been so much piling on. And like I've said before, there's this stacking that goes on. If you say something bad about conservatives or Trump, then the next person has to say something worse. And then eventually you're saying outrageous things just to top the last person. And yet these are the same people that say, words are like weapons. Words can be harmful. Well, look at the words you're using. Now, I have to say that I watch Greg Gutfeld periodically on Fox, and I think that his observation is probably the same one we've made, but I think it's very true, and that is that if you paint someone as one of the most despicable characters in history and do it hard enough and long enough, what do you think is going to happen? You don't think that there's going to be some beginning anyway, some of the fringes out there that are going to begin inappropriately. Then there will be those who want to act inappropriately and are just looking for an excuse. And then pretty soon you got a real problem. And then you also have a lot of danger. And when you take a step back, because you think, well, we'd fix that. I mean, we couldn't let that go on. Look what we have let go on. Do you think that strolling around any of our cities now is particularly safe? Do you think that if something happens to you, you're robbed, mugged, whatever the case might be, some of these really unattractive things I won't even discuss, that you're going to see any justice done? I mean, justice is maybe an elastic concept, but we got a pretty good idea what something ought to happen. Those kinds of things just seem to be floating off the table. I would say that some of the cities in this country have become no man's land for individuals who don't have to go there or live there. How many of you would venture to some of these cities just to hang around? Now, some of them have some great stuff to see. There's a lot of stuff in New York that's cool. I don't want to walk around in any right now. Washington, D.C. is the seat of our government. And it has a lot of monuments and just amazing things to see. I've been there, several times. And I still haven't seen even close to all of it. But I don't want to go back. So I'm certainly not now. I'd love to go back at some point. But not now. I mean, I've been reading a lot about what's happening in Washington, D.C. It's even worse than we hear. Partly because we hear so much about New York. But let me tell you, D.C. and Baltimore, to some extent Philadelphia, are really, really becoming feral societies over there. And it's reported mainly as the homeless and the unhoused and the occasional story about some terrible crime. But it's the everyday crime and the everyday inability of a citizen who's paying his taxes to enjoy something about the city, inability to get anything done. For an example, some of you have been following this in New York City. They have a tremendous amount of, let's say, undocumented people there that they're putting up in hotels and stuff like that, just like you'd expect. And they also are coming up with a lot of motorbikes. Now, scooters, e-bikes, regular motorcycles, smaller motorcycles, and so forth, are just showing up. These guys have latched onto them. Now, some of that is because in a lot of these countries, that's a primary mode of transportation. It works pretty well. Gas is cheaper to run it as opposed to, running a V8. And it serves your purposes. So that's understandable. It's also a good way to get around in a city if you want to do something and get away. One of the things that I read about that I thought was indicative was there is a whole underground, it's not really underground, subculture to try and emulate larger motorbikes as smaller motorbikes so they don't have to have a license. Not that the police in New York have that much time to stop people for not having licenses on their motorbikes. They don't. But if it's below 50 cc's, you don't need a license for it. So there are some motorcycles out there, and I mean motorcycles. I saw pictures of them that are so obviously not 50cc motorcycles, but have a plate on them that says 50 cc's. This gives you some idea of kind of that weird breakdown. This is the kind of thing when we talk about the broken windows deal, is how these little things just add up. I mean, if you're able to pirate a bike, a motorbike, completely ignore licensing, registration, your own permission to ride it, whatever the case may be. Because, see, some of these, because of their small displacement size, don't require a driver's license either. That's a good thing. Not that they ask for many of them there anyway. So that is exactly a version of the broken windows theory. Why? Because it is certainly a symbol of just lawlessness. People running around on the streets, riding motorbikes. Now, we're seeing a lot of crime take place. There's a lot of snatch and grab robberies. You've seen them in some of the countries in South America and Latin America. That, you come along, usually two people on a bike, sometimes just one, he's very inventive, comes flying along and snags a purse or a cell phone or whatever else is value they think you have on them, and then they're gone. Now, that may not go very well for the victim, because someone moving at speed on any kind of motorized contraption can cause you some pretty good harm if they hit you or grab you and jerk you with that power that's inherent in that kinetic energy and knock you down, throw you all over the place. And then they're gone. How do you find them again? There's a lot of those people running around. There's no identification. Most of them don't have any license plates, assuming you get one of those. I mean, how are you supposed to? And many of these people are, quote, undocumented. Now, remember, undocumented means we don't necessarily know who you are. Yeah, let's think about that. We'll get back in this other court decision I want to talk about. All right, everybody, we're back. I'll try and stay on topic now, at least within the time frame that I've allotted, which seems to mean nothing in my notes here. I mean, I say this will take a certain amount of time, and then it takes a lot longer. But here's the case I want to talk about, because I do want to get to this. This last week, the Supreme Court, in addition to this immunity ruling, which, by the way, it's just codifying in many ways, if you want to call it that. Really, court decisions aren't code, but it's simply putting in black letter law things that we've been doing since the beginning. Nobody thought that the kinds of things that are being done to Donald Trump would be done to an ex-president, sitting president, whatever the case may be. It just never came up. People weren't so reckless, and it is reckless to the country to do things like this, to go that far. And hey, we've had some people in the last 100 years to go pretty far. But they haven't done that. They haven't turned it into a third world circus where you utilize the so-called justice system of the state against all your political enemies. Now, we're not naive or foolish here. We recognize that most of the time in the regulatory agencies, the dice are loaded against anybody conservative. We understand that. We learned that with Michelle Lerner and the IRS, and some of the certifications of their 501c3 groups seem to go a lot harder and longer if they were conservative in some way. The conservative group, they were surprised. Really. You have an entire whole mechanism now of governmental employees and regulatory agencies that depend on government being run a certain way. You, as a conservative, think that government ought to run a different way. Do you think that affects their opinion about things? And this is what's dangerous about growing these public service unions, is that you eventually reach some tipping point, right, where nobody wants to vote to change anything because they're afraid the change will be them. I always use the National Health Service in Britain as an example because they're the largest employer in the country. People don't like it. People want to reform it. They want to change this, that, but they don't do it. Because if they change it, something's going to change for some of those people. And even if they think there needs to be change, they're afraid somebody else might not agree with what change needs to be needed, and maybe they might be out of a job or something like that. So they continue to keep it rolling along. Well, it doesn't really roll along. Lurch, fall, zigzag, all that kind of stuff. But we have the same thing in this country coming. We are constantly growing the size of government. And we say that without really thinking what that means. Because what we're really saying is we're growing the voter pool to support progressive, regulatory-hungry politicians. It doesn't mean that everybody that's a federal employee or state employee or some sort of public employee is a liberal, progressive who doesn't want the best for the country. It just means that it becomes more and more of a self-interest thing to not let people who want to change stuff very much get the reins of power, because you never know what they're going to do. And it might somehow affect you. Because they're talking about changing government, cutting government, getting waste. Now, nobody ever thinks they're the waste, do they? I mean, usually the people who are wasting the most time and money in an organization are the ones who are least aware of it, and are also the most self-important. But nevertheless, this last hiring cycle, and I should say the one before this, because I haven't seen the figures on this last employment figures, the largest growth in employment, and I mentioned this before, was in government and healthcare. Now, we need healthcare, but it's not producing a whole lot. You're not selling things, you're not putting things into the economic pipeline. Government doesn't put anything in there. They try and extract things from the economic pipeline. Their job is to try and make the economic system work better, smooth the edges off, make it work a little more, I know it sounds crazy, doesn't it? Make it work more quickly and those types of things. Of course, that's never what happens because it becomes personal. And the power that's associated with some of these positions is just too easy to misuse sometimes. Or it's too easy to be susceptible to cognitive biases that they have. And if the bias is that the government is always right because you're part of the government, that's not good news for people out there like you and I. So this court decision I want to talk about, some of you may have heard it, but it's a little bit misnamed, if you want. Well, it's not misnamed. It's called Looper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo. Now, what that is it's actually a case that was brought against the National Maritime Fisheries Service. Now, that doesn't come up for most of us out here where we're not fishing in the ocean very much. But it's the federal agency that regulates the size of commercial fishing catches to prevent, quote, overfishing. And these people, the Looper Bright Enterprises, which is a small group of these fishermen, felt that they'd went too far. I'll see what you think. The National Marine Fisheries Service was requiring these fishing boats along this would be up along the, probably near the North Atlantic, off Newfoundland and off of the New England area and so forth mainly. That's where there's a lot of fishing going on. That they were supposed to carry on their boat an inspector, an observer, when they go out to make sure they don't overfish. Now, how does it get along to where you have to take somebody along with you to your job to make sure you're doing it right? All right, that's I can see from just guessing what's on the other side of the radio that people are like, what? Yeah, that's what they've been doing. And that's not what this was even brought about, if you can imagine that. What it was brought about was because the National Marine Fisheries Service decided recently that under the regulations that they see, they could impose one more thing upon these folks. That was that they had to pay the wages of the observers going out on the boats. Now, they broke this out. Each boat owner would cost him about $710 a day for this character's wages. First of all, think about how much those observers are getting paid. Especially when you consider observing doesn't seem like it's a real tough job, per se. Isn't observing something you kind of do to kind of like waste the day away, like, I'm going to go check on this guy's work. So, $710 a day. So, they just couldn't take that anymore. And they joined a lawsuit saying that, look, okay, we're overregulated, and we don't think that this particular board or boards like it have the ability to interpret their enabling statutes, the actual codification that creates the agencies, any way they want to give them power to do things like that. Well, you would think that would be kind of a no-brainer, which, we know plenty of no-brainers. We have a vice president that's a no-brainer, and a president that's a, let's say, a exoplanet brainer. And so what they've decided to do is come in and say, look, we need to examine the methodology that the courts go through when they look at the regulatory powers of these agencies. Now, follow me here. Because for about 40 years, there has been a case out there called Chevron Incorporated versus Natural Resources Defense Council. And in Chevron, the court decided, this is a 1984 case, by the way, the case required the courts to follow a process to review federal agency regulations by a business or somebody that's saying it's too much. And they were supposed to say, okay, well, if the agency claims that Congress, when they created the agency, had been silent or ambiguous in some way, defining the powers of the agency, then the courts had to defer to the reasonable interpretation of the agency. Let's break that down. So, unless Congress specifies very particularly the power, inherent powers, and even the jurisdiction in some cases, of some of these regulatory agencies when they create them, then the courts, if you say, hey, this is too much, have to look at it, and if they haven't said this very specific thing, well, they can't do this, then you have to defer to the interpretation of the agency about whether or not they can. Well, let that soak in for a minute. Now, there is one thing we do know, and that's Congress is pretty sloppy. And as part of that sloppiness, they write very broad statutory stuff in their legislation. They create these agencies, and they leave all sorts of ambiguous corners on them because they think, well, something might happen and we can't anticipate it, so we're going to make sure that they have the ability to meet that demand. Well, that ambiguity is to their benefit. Because under Chevron, if there wasn't something especially that said you couldn't do it, and it seemed to be within the purview of the statute, like fisheries or whatever the case may be, then the court had to say, well, there's nothing that Congress says they can't do it. They haven't interpreted it anyway, so we have to go along with the way the agency's interpreting it. Well, you can see over the last 40 years what a great job that has done. I mean, it has given agencies, agencies. I mean, we're talking about everybody from the FCC to the FAA to National Marine Fisheries Group to everybody. Anytime they want to interpret their regulations, which are very broad, in a way that they like. Unless they're told pretty much that they can't do it, and it seems sort of under the general umbrella of their authority, then they can do it. That's what the courts are supposed to do. I don't know how they came to Chevron. I don't know how you think that. Now, there's a certain degree of laziness in this, where the courts obviously didn't want to have to get into the weeds on all these regulations and just say, well, if you think you can do it and, no one said you can't, I guess you can. We also have had something called the Administrative Procedure Act, which, gosh, it's old. I want to say 1940s. And that actually lays out how you're supposed to work within these agencies, how they're supposed to operate. Okay? Now, Justice Roberts wrote, the APA was basically ignored by Chevron, not the Chevron's case. Chevron turns the statutory scheme for judicial review of agency action upside down. There it is. Because what it says is the interpretation of the law is being deferred to the agency, not to the courts. Now, the courts don't really have much of another job besides determining what the law says. So, in their opinion, they got in the Wayback Machine and went back to the founding principles of Marbury v. Mason, in the 1803 case. Marbury v. Madison, I slurred there. When the framework was set up for the courts to review the actions of the legislative branch to see that they are congruent with the powers and actions that are within their governmental power that is given to them by the Constitution. And so you can see how the Chevron case runs counter to that, right? It switches it around. And Roberts, who has, misfires many times, we all may remember his misfire when he had the opportunity on Obamacare to do what should have been done, but wasn't. Nevertheless, he's exactly on point here. This is the upside-down world. This is letting the people who are wielding the law decide what it means and how they do it. unless they're told specifically by Congress pretty much that they can't do it. We had 40 years of that kind of deference with the courts. That's why we're at now. That is a huge case. That is a huge change in the way the courts have to look at things. Now, I'm getting a little worried that the courts down the line from the Supreme Court aren't listening really well. I get that feeling from some of these firearms cases. They don't like that Bruin versus the New York case that talks about if you're going to have a gun control, it has to be within the historical context of what was understood at the time of the Constitution, what people were able to do. Now, they don't like that because it makes them explain things, and they have to meet some kind of standard. So they can't just say, oh, there are no firearms or we don't want them. Well, that wasn't the case. That's not what the Second Amendment means. That's not even what was thought about when it was being written. So the historical context of that is a problem. You've got to have some reasons for doing this. It has to be the same kind of reasons that would have been something that were viable within the boundaries of the Constitution when it was written. It seems like some of the lower courts, particularly like in the Ninth Circuit and places like that, don't like that interpretation. So we're still getting some of these wacky laws coming up to keep testing that decision by the Supreme Court, hoping that it'll just kind of, go away, that it'll get muddied up enough by the district courts and the appellate courts, the circuit courts of appeals, and not taken up again by the Supreme Court to just kind of be forgotten about, or just sort of smeared around so its lines aren't quite as bright. So you see that, it makes you wonder, are they going to continue to follow Chevron a little bit here? Because you can say that you considered it yourself and then just go along with the agency. So we don't really know what exactly the guidelines are going to be in this situation. They've definitely changed. The change is significant. And the significance of the change all by itself is sending all sorts of hysteria through the administrative state. If you look at some of the places that have a lot of folks that run around in the federal agencies and are mid-levels and up that are involved in websites and whatnot, writing about these things, they don't like this at all. I mean, not just don't like it, they think it's the end of the world. Partly because they've gotten so far off topic with some of their regulation that they know it's not going to be explainable within the confines of the enabling statute. It just wasn't there, so they got away with it. That's all going to change if people decide to follow, if the courts decide to follow the new case in Loper. Now, in the past, eventually everybody sort of gets in line on these things. They mess with it because they don't like it, and it goes up to a higher enough court until they get slapped down again. They go along with it. But I feel this kind of bizarre sense of lawlessness in the United States anymore. Makes me worry about everything, even that. But that is probably as important as anything that happened this week, including Bubbling Joe. Maybe not quite as important, but right there. It's just so much easier to talk about somebody who can't put three words together and falls asleep in the middle of sentences than it is to talk about sort of kind of complicated legal mumbo-jumbo or mumbo-jumbo-jumbo. And so that's what gets hit. But for your purposes out there, folks, this decision that overrules Chevron is a big deal because these agencies affect everything you do. Now, out here in the West, where we're at, think about the Bureau of Land Management, their interpretation of just everything they do. Park Service, you name it. They get to interpret, if the statute is silent on it or ambiguous, they get to interpret to their benefit, and the courts are supposed to give a deference. We'll know more. So we're going to start seeing a lot of challenges to existing regulations based on this ruling. And then we're going to see people who are ready to challenge new regulation based on this decision. when before it was just almost a waste of time. Unless you had a really good case about something in the legislative intent or in the actual wording that you could go back to, you were just kind of cooked because they deferred. And it's not happening anymore. And a lot of you folks that are listening out there live in areas that are really, without you thinking about it, are heavily regulated. Any place that is west of the Mississippi has a tremendous amount of, quote, government land. Colorado here has quite a bit. Nevada is mostly government land, for instance. And this land is controlled, access, use, and all of this stuff, and how you behave on it, by the Bureau of Land Management and several other agencies. And all of that behavior is usually regulated by self-generated regulations. Congress does not write those regulations. They empower the agency to write those regulations. And they're only valid now so long as they are within the confines of what was intended. And I mean you have to prove was intended and granted to them by Congress. Now this is going to be messy because Congress is messy. Like I said in the beginning, they take most of these statutes to create an agency and they throw it out there and they create it and they put a bunch of lofty stuff in it. You know, well, it's to do good and not do bad and to help but not hurt. And so it leaves a lot of ambiguity for these guys to work around it. And they've liked that up to now. But that may change with this one. So I would say that this decision is going to affect a lot of what happens in the West, simply because how vulnerable we are to regulation of our behavior on public lands or the use of public lands. I mean, if you look at the amount of regulations that get generated every year by these agencies. I used to work in the law library and in Boulder, and one of the things we did there at the end, it was a transition between everything being on computer and still being written down, we would have big loose leaf folders that we'd store for the Code of Federal Regulations. And every week, I would get a big bundle of pages that I would have to stick into these huge binders. And there were a lot of the binders because it was new stuff. Happened all the time. Obscure, weird little stuff that could affect people in many different ways that just got popped in there. No congressional action, no real oversight, just there. So that's good for us.
Hi, folks. Thanks for listening. Listen, if you'd like to listen to more and you want to maybe perhaps have someone else listen to our podcast, you can do so either by going right to our webpage, politicalviking.com, or therickwagnershow.com. Both of them take you there. You can get links right directly to our podcast, or you can hear our podcast on Podbean, on iTunes, and Spotify, and a couple others. So you can find us. We appreciate it if you do. And if you've heard the show, you want somebody else to hear it, that's a good way to send it to them. Thanks for listening.